Ah, hey, Evelyn, if you don't mind, I'm not able to share my screen. We tested this just a minute ago and it worked.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. How's that now?
I can see your screen.
Awesome. Well, hello, I am Jeff Hoge. I work as an information security engineer in the healthcare industry. I also serve as vice president in the triad of North Carolina ISSA chapter. And thank you so much for joining today. The title of this discussion is Password Security, the 800-63-pound gorilla. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things today, but first, I'll just real quickly go over, here's what I'm planning on talking through. I want to talk through first, I want to make a case for passwords. Why do they still matter? And why do you need to help with this? Regardless of who you are, what your role is, you can help resolve this issue or help mitigate many of the issues about passwords. I'll talk very briefly about some NIST guidance. That's something that the federal government provides that gives recommendations on how to handle passwords or how to handle information security of all kinds. And then I'd like to talk through the true cause of password problems. It might not be what you think it is. And then finally, I want to speak about how do we deal with this issue? How do we figure out the problems that are out there in our organizations? And how do we fix those things with prevention? And then a couple of last words at the end. But before I say anything, I have to give this disclaimer. The opinions that I discuss today don't reflect my employer. I like who I work for. I want to continue working for my company. They don't reflect ISSA, and they don't even reflect our chapter. And I'll also tell you, and this is like a second disclaimer, this is going to come out as probably a pretty opinionated talk. And I'll talk with you about some lessons that I've had to learn over the last few years. You may not agree with me, and that is perfectly fine. You may very well know everything that I'm presenting on today. And to everyone listening here, I struggled even last night with this thought. Do people that are attending this, do they really need to hear this? Or is this something that everyone already knows? But what I hope is that a couple of the things that I present today will help you. And when I sit through a talk, if I sit through a 1-hour presentation and I learn one or two things, it's absolutely worth it. It's worth every bit of time that I spent in that talk. And so hopefully you can come away with this with just a couple of things that may help you in your role now or in the future. So I want to make a case for passwords. Passwords still matter. Now, to start with this, passwords are very old. They predate computers. They predate computers by thousands of years, but they were first used with computer systems in 1961. In fact, I was doing some reading the other day, password hashing, where you store not the password itself, but you store this calculated sum of a password instead. Hashing has been used with passwords since the 1970s. So this is a really old concept with computer systems. And passwords are weak. There's a kryptonite of passwords, and we all know what it is. It's human knowledge. It's the fact that we have to know what our password is. And this is exactly why we have trouble remembering our passwords. This is exactly why many of us, or possibly some of our organization's users, set easy passwords because they fear forgetting those passwords. Human knowledge is also why users tend to use the same password in more than one place. It's the kryptonite of passwords is just simply human knowledge. You may have seen this. This is probably 10 years old. There's this great video online of a person walking around interviewing people in public, asking them what their password is. And people are just willingly sharing their password. And I know we laugh at that, and we laugh at how easy it was to socially engineer these people by just asking them on camera. But the fact of the matter is this: because it's in our brains, it's something that can be shared, It's something that can be duplicated by other people. And so that's a weakness of passwords. And so you can look around online and you can find lots of people for the last 16, 17 years saying this, making this statement: the password is dead. In fact, I like what I see a lot, which is the password is dead, long live the password. We know it's weak. We know we hate passwords. And this seems to be the entire information technology field. We know that passwords are a problem. And so we keep saying that they're dead over and over again. And the funny thing is, there have been technologies, there have been moves to try to fix the problems of human knowledge, to try to fix the problem of passwords. For example, multi-factor authentication. And let me stop and say, multi-factor authentication is good. It's great. And it certainly helps and should be leveraged everywhere that you can, everywhere that it makes sense to leverage multi-factor authentication. But passwords are still very prominent. And so I'll just stop and say for a moment, if you're helping a user protect themselves, protect even their personal life, have them turn on multi-factor with Gmail or Facebook or whatever they use. It's going to help in our organizations. Multi-factor makes all the sense in the world for remote access. But the deal is, there's a limit to what multi-factor can provide, and passwords are still very much around. I hear lots of technology companies talk about this magic world where passwordless authentication is a thing. And you see it in a lot of products and even in some industries where we get away from a knowledge-based secret. We get away from human knowledge. We're using things like device certificate authentication. And that's, believe me, that is great. But the problem here is this: we all agree with passwordless being the future, but here's the crux of our issue. Passwords are cheap and easy. That's why almost every website that you log into, every web portal in existence, still uses passwords. I haven't run the statistics on this, but I would guess that a very, very, very small minority of web portals have implemented multi-factor authentication or have implemented federation, so you can use your organization's portal to protect that. And so I like a couple of cryptographers said some years ago, no other single technology matches their combination of cost, immediacy, and convenience as passwords. And so what am I getting at? Passwords aren't going anywhere, not anytime soon, at least. And many web portals and applications still use passwords as the sole authentication factor for the foreseeable future. And and to add insult to this injury, or to add insult to this, cloud services, they have been very prominent. They have started to multiply, and they've started to multiply in our organizations. And so as cloud services, there's been this uptick of it. In many cases, it's placed password controls in our users' hands, our non-technical users' hands. And you may be sitting here saying, well, I don't have cloud. Let me ask you, do you have a payroll portal for a third-party service that handles your company's payroll? I would guess that a minority of companies have that federated through their own sign-in service. So you've got a payroll portal, probably not managed by IT. It's managed by some part of your business, and they're setting passwords. They're setting password rules. They're handing out passwords to people. And I don't know about you, but I want to be paid. So this problem of password security, it's something that we've got to deal with. How about your company's bank account? You've got finance people connecting to banking portals. How about a legal team that maybe manages DocuSign for your organization? Maybe you federate everything. Maybe in your organization, you've figured out a way to force every time finance logs into the banking portal, or every time payroll logs into the payroll portal, to send that through your directory to make sure multi-factor is used. But the problem is, there's lots of web portals in use that are critical to our businesses. and those portals use predominantly passwords. So this is bad. Not only is the password not going away, at least at large scale, but passwords are quickly getting out of the hands of the IT department. So this is our responsibility to improve. Have you ever heard of the Nirvana fallacy? The Nirvana fallacy basically says that anything less than perfect isn't worth doing. And this seeps into our thinking as technologists. We start having thoughts like, and I stole this from Wikipedia, seatbelts are a bad idea. People are still going to die from car crashes, right? This is a logical problem of don't fasten your seatbelt because there's still car crashes and there's still people that are going to die from them somewhere. And this seeps into our thinking that if we take steps to improve a password, it's not as good as just doing away with a password altogether. And so let's just not improve on that. And so, we like to say perfect is the enemy of good. Don't wait around for a perfect solution that's not going to happen. Strive for something good. Strive for the next steps. Strive to close the doors that you have open or the security holes that you have open. Passwords have many issues, but ignoring this issue won't go away. And I'll also say, regardless of your role, if you work in information security, maybe if you work as a service desk or a help desk person, maybe you're trying to get your foot in the door. Regardless of the role you have in an organization, you can help improve password security. Maybe you're the most green person on a help desk team. You have the least seniority there. You can start by setting a good example for password practices. And I'll talk about a couple of those practices today, but this is really our responsibility. I'll also say, and this was from Verizon's 2019 data breach investigative report, 80% of hacking related breaches that they investigated are linked to passwords. In fact, I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day. Almost every major data breach involved a weakness. Major data breach recently involved a weakness in password security somewhere in the kill chain. Colonial Pipeline involved passwords, weaknesses in passwords. I don't know if anybody read about this. Last week, CVS had 1 billion health records that were breached. And one of the first things you'll find if you Google that news story is that database of members or that database of patients wasn't even password protected. And there's this shocking stat. This was on a 2019 study by Google. Only 45% of Americans say that they would change their password after being hacked. So the lesson here is we've got to do better. Now, by the way, if you see the silly meme on the side, I sprinkled in a couple of these password memes. Sometimes this isn't going to have much to do with the slide I'm presenting on, but when I train users on passwords, when I train users on practices, I like to catch their attention. I like to be a little bit silly. So I'm showing you a couple of my favorite ones here. Maybe this is something that you want to use in your own training material. NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. This is part of the federal government. They have a publication called 800-63. This is where I got the tongue-in-cheek title of the presentation today, Password Security, the 800-63-pound gorilla. But NIST established digital identity guidelines. Now, these are recommendations. These are not requirements. Many federal agencies have put these out as requirements, and these standards have made their way into other requirements. But this is a document that NIST renews every few years. And their guidelines, their recommendations, and those guidelines are technology agnostic. You can read this guide and learn how to secure your passwords in your Google Apps environment, or if you're running Active Directory, or maybe you're writing your own application that has authentication built in, or you're writing a web portal. They're technology agnostic. But again, these documents establish recommendations, and I think they're worth reading over. The point of the presentation today isn't to go over this document, but I want to point out a couple things. You may remember seeing this. This was about 4 years ago. NIST renewed this document in 2017, and it created a ton of articles, a ton of, I'll say it this way, a ton of clickbait articles over the internet, basically saying the government says we can turn off password expirations. And that was the clickbait article. Now, what that came from is that came from an addition that was made to NIST's document in 2017, which says verifiers should not require memorized secrets to be changed arbitrarily, like every 60 days, every 90 days, periodically. However, verifiers shall force a change if there is evidence of compromise of the authenticator. The problem is this: lots of people in 2017 said, the government says we can turn off password expirations. Lots of people in organizations started saying, please, can we turn off this password expiration, and make things easier? The problem was, I think that a lot of those clickbait articles, they don't make a mention of the rest of those guidelines. The rest of those guidelines are very powerful, and it would be an absolute mistake to make these easy changes, like doing away with password expiration, without strengthening any other passwords or any other practices. NIST made this statement for a really good reason. They figured out that if users stop, if you expire passwords, if you require users to rotate their password every 60 days, it results in Post-it notes. It results in users setting a number in the middle of their password and just adding 1 to that number each time. I know none of us do that, but take a look at this document. There's lots of recommendations on how to address password controls. Another thing, and this is not really going to talk about this today, but in this same document, NIST started saying that that they don't recommend anymore having a certain number of character sets in passwords. But again, don't just take one line out of those recommendations without seeing everything else that they're recommending. So the rest of this presentation is going to get really practical. I want to talk about, and this is going to be the thesis of my entire presentation. I'm going to go back to this over and over and over again. Password problems are behavioral. Password problems are not technical. And I'll say, as a technologist, I like to think of every problem as being a technical problem. I like to think that if I can just learn or put the right piece of equipment, the right piece of software in place, or the right configuration in place, I can fix these problems, not with passwords. I'll give you some examples of these password problems. And as I go through this list, I know this isn't a complete list, but I just want to put this in your mind that this is a human issue. This isn't a technology issue. Password reuse. This happens all over the place. Users use the same password in multiple services. And this is a problem, because what if one of those services stores your password in clear text? What if one of those services is breached? Well, now potentially the bad guys have your password and they can try it in a lot of different areas. So password reuse, that's a major issue. We know that's a major issue. Password sharing, that's when several users run the same password. Perhaps they're giving passwords to one another. Perhaps someone in Sally in accounting is handing the password to someone else while she's gone. Password sharing, this is a real issue as well. And so, because that takes accountability completely out of it. Now Sally can't take responsibility for her actions anymore. So password sharing is a real issue. Poor password storage. All right, we see this all the time. There's been jokes for years about Post-it notes, passwords on Post-it notes, passwords in text files, passwords in notebooks. Passwords are being stored incorrectly. And again, that's a human issue. Technical controls won't fix that issue. Making passwords more complicated won't fix the issue of poor password storage. Passwords being easy to guess, or personal information in your password. your name, perhaps a spouse's name, a street you live on, your mother's maiden name. This personal information, this easy to guess information, it's just contributing to these overall issues. It's a password breach waiting to happen. Talked about this one a little bit earlier. Sequential digits. That means adding a 1 to the, or adding a digit in your password every time you need to change it, or using the same pattern of a password over and over and over again. How about this one? IT doesn't want to change the password requirements, or the business doesn't want to change password requirements. We know we have a weakness, but we don't want to have that hard talk with the business about changing the way that we do things. That's a behavioral issue. That's not a technical issue. We have the technical chops to fix this. Unfortunately, we've got to change people's behaviors. I can't believe I just did that. I went right all the way to the end. Okay. Passwords not hashed. What this means, and this is largely an IT issue or a service provider issue. We have lots and lots of cases of a password being stored in a database. You sign up for a web portal as a user, as just an internet user. You sign up for a web portal, you type in a password when you create it, but you don't know that your password is actually being stored in the database. It's not taking this hash, which is not reversible. It's not even encrypting, which hashing would be a better medium or a better way to do this, but it's storing your real password in a database, which means a couple of things. It means that service provider knows your password. What if there's a malicious user that works for that service provider? What if you went online and registered for a forum with a password, and that forum is storing that password in the clear in a database? What if there's a malicious user at that organization or at that forum provider? Or how about this? What if there's a malicious user at the web service that hosts that forum? There's lots of variables here. And of course, what if there's a breach? What if that data is broken into? What if there's a SQL injection attack against that database? Well, now they have your name, your password, your email, and those can be used again because you probably used your password in multiple places. They can be used again to log into your email, your Facebook, that kind of thing. And certainly corporate accounts. Behavioral issue, bad password distribution. Now, I don't want to offend anyone today, but as technologists, sometimes we look for the easy way out. We need to make sure that anyone who's giving out passwords, that this is done in a secure way. And we see it all the time. People are sending passwords insecurely, perhaps through an email or maybe even in a ticket note if you have a ticketing system. Maybe they're assigning the same password to huge swaths of users, establishing duplicate passwords everywhere. Maybe those passwords are too easy, or maybe the person that works for the help desk is ticking that password never expires box. Sorry, what's that?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't on mute and someone just scared me. Go ahead.
So maybe the person is ticking that password never expires box. They want to make it easier on the user, and they're ticking this box, circumventing some of the controls in the organization. Or maybe the person isn't requiring the user to set their own password. A user requests a password reset, and IT still knows that user's password. Well, now here we have an issue, because if that account is ever used for malicious purposes, or that user's account is doing something it shouldn't be doing, that user can always point at IT and say, John Doe and IT knows my password, they did it. So this is bad password distribution. What do all these have in common? All these issues have in common, look on the right, the easy button. Human beings inherently look for the easy solution. I almost said this or had this in the notes. Human beings are inherently lazy. All of us are. That's why some people will continue using the same password they began using in 1998. That's why many web portals will use passwords for the foreseeable future. That's why many of us in IT love quick fixes like turning on MFA and turning off password expirations, but we don't like having those tough conversations with the business about changing things. Now, you can use technical controls to help fix these issues, but almost all these issues are not changed, or they're not fixed by simply changing a password length. And to NIST's point, that last slide I showed you, strong technical controls like frequent password expirations, if you just look for that quick technical solution, well, in many cases, that causes users to just go around the system. So we've got to change our users' behavior. Now, when we go to strengthen password security, the first thing we've got to start with is discovery. We've got to figure out where our problems are. Now, again, there's a temptation in IT that we want to roll up our sleeves and just fix the problem. But in the case of password security, slow your roll because we've got to measure first. I like what Peter Drucker said. He said, you can't manage what you can't measure. A 30-character password minimum might just be awesome in your eyes, but your leadership probably won't agree with that. There's a significant cost, a business cost to a 30-character password minimum. So you need to be able to give leadership actionable data before you change the rules. And so attempt to discover where you're weak before you start attacking the problem. Look at things like user habits, IT habits, commonly breached passwords that are in use. Lots of organizations deal with this. And even duplicate password use. If you look at things like, are multiple users using the same password? I'm going to show you a few things on that in a minute. And I'll also say this discovery process needs to happen, and it needs to continue to happen. We need to do audits over time, even after we think we've fixed the issue, because auditing over time will give you a measure of how effective your controls are. Maybe in 5 years, there are better ways to help control bad password practices. The only way you really know is auditing. I'm going to give one last disclaimer. I gave a couple in the beginning, but here in a moment, I'm going to give you some advice or some things that I have found is very valuable in strengthening password habits. But please get permission from your organization before you proceed. So the first type of discovery of password problems that I like to do is what I'll call a social stage of password problems. You need to get a measure on how your users and IT behaves concerning passwords. You've got to figure that out. Now, you may have been in your organization long enough where you just have knowledge of how people handle passwords. There may be some things that you've been able to learn or glean from as far as you've been at your organization, but you're going to have to do a little bit of legwork to see where these problems are or what these problems are. Now, I'll also tell you, if you're first starting with strengthening password security in your organization, it might be good, especially if you don't regularly train on password practices, it might be good to just go ahead and communicate general password guidelines at the beginning of this process. Now, you can do that any method you want. I'll talk about some training methods in a little bit. Maybe that's just an email blast, or maybe that's a lunch and learn, but communicate just general guidelines. You're not really attacking any specific issues in your organization, but start communicating out password practices. Maybe even personal password practices, like using a password vault or a password manager at home. Start getting that advice out to users. And here's what's going to happen. If your communication is effective enough, when you send out guidelines, if your communication is effective enough and you're building a bridge to your users, people will start coming to you. People will start asking you, hey, I see this practice going on in my business unit. Is this a problem? People will start coming to you for advice. And so find and develop influencers around the organization. And by the way, on the note of influencers, just a little tip. IT will tell you some things. Now, maybe you work in an information security area and you got people in IT that are not fans of you. Find a way to build the bridge. Find a way to get in front of them with actionable information. And so IT will tell you some things. The help desk or the service desk will tell you some things, some practices they may have seen that they need to improve on. No, not everyone will speak up, but try to find some influencers, some security advocates around your organization. IT may tell you that this specific business unit has an app where everyone's sharing a password. Is that okay? They may ask you that. Again, if you do this right, people will start coming to you. Make a note of these password problems. Make a note of where these issues exist, because again, these are behavioral issues. Also, here's something else. Use SneakerNet. Walk around the office. I know many of us are remote right now, but you're going to find passwords stored in a lot of very public areas, not just Post-it notes on people's monitors, but I've heard of cases where company training rooms, where brand new users are being trained, where there's a Post-it note with a sample username and password that they need to use through training. Take a note of those things. Now, and by the way, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit, now would be a good time to come up with a secure file for these, I'll call them institutional passwords that are in use. So for example, if all the training users use a password called password 123 to access their training system, note that down, keep that in a secure file. If you found a Post-it note in the parking lot where someone had a password written down, pick up that Post-it note and take a note of that. Now, you may be sitting here saying you're uncomfortable with that information. Here's the deal. The bad guys could have easily picked up that Post-it note. Other users could have easily picked up that Post-it note, and you're trying to figure out where these issues are. And that's going to come in very handy here in a little bit. Once upon a time, somewhere I worked in my career, I found a Post-it note that was on a server rack. So it was attached to a server rack with administrative passwords on it. But here was the crazy, and that's crazy enough, that's bad enough. Here was the other crazy thing. It was in a shared data center. It was in a co-location data center. So anyone walking in there, any of the other customers could see this Post-it note with an organization's password on it. So you're going to find things like that. And by the way, when I say SneakerNet, that's also true virtually. You're going to find password files laying around. You're going to find, and when I say password files, I'm talking about on like a public share, passwords.txt. You may find big wikis and knowledge bases where sample passwords are being shared. Make a note of these things. And so just start discovering where you think your issues are in your organization. And it starts very socially. Now, I'll also tell you the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to gear this mainly towards Windows Active Directory systems. I know that's what most organizations run these days for their authentication, but you can adapt this in your own environment. The next part of discovery is you need to look at what your administrators are doing, what their behavior is and their practices are. Look around in your directory. You can query your directory. You can do this with PowerShell and some different tools. You can do this for free if you want. Look around for accounts set with password never expires ticked on it. And if you find a lot of this, or if you find a lot of, say, VIPs, executives, leaders, salespeople, with password never expires checked, that's a really good sign that the easy solution is being looked for. Now, maybe leadership is prompting this, but at this point, you're just discovering, you're just figuring out where the issues are. And so look around for that. That's just been a big red flag that I've seen when it comes to training an IT team or training a help desk team. The other thing that I like to do is I like to make sure that users, the passwords they're running around with day to day, that those weren't just set by IT for the user. I want to make sure my users have set their own passwords. And there's a couple of ways to do this in discovery. The way that I do this is you can look at an event ID. Event ID 4724 will show you every password reset, and you can look at a flag on every user's directory account that tells you the last time they set it. You can do that a couple of ways. Here's one method for doing it with PowerShell. But if you find that an administrator reset the password and that user is still functioning with the password that was set at that exact time, what that means is the user did not set their own password. The user, maybe it wasn't enforced that they changed their own password, but look around for that. That little ghost exists in a lot of companies. Look on your ticketing system. Do you have passwords that are being shared in your ticketing system? Do you have passwords being thrown through clear text email? Do you have passwords being shared in text files? And try to figure out, is a user or an administrator setting these? And by the way, if you're seeing similar passwords being set with huge swaths of users, it's safe to say that these are in live use. So let me give you an example. Let's say your help desk sets this password to lots of users, password 3. And then when a user gets in front of their computer, they've got to set a new password. What do you think many users try to set their password to? If you guessed password 4, you'd be surprised how often that happens. If your help desk sets passwords to June 2021, what do you think happens in 2 months when a user is forced to change it in August? They're going to continue those habits. They're going to continue that example that was set for them. So this is really useful information, and you need to store this in a file somewhere. And again, I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, I'm a fan of administratively forcing a user to change the password once they use it the first time. I'm a fan of that. Maybe your organization has that rule already. Still look for this stuff. You're going to find a lot of bad behavior or bad habits there. And also you may find there's written procedures that are being followed that contain poor password practices. IT may have a 20 or 30-year-old practice to write down someone's password and hand it to them. That may actually be in a written procedure. You may find that a business unit that's setting passwords for a company web portal, that they're doing that and they're sharing a password without forcing a change over email. All right, so your purpose here is to do discovery on practices and behaviors. You're not doing this to narc on every person that breaks the rules once. That's not the point of doing this set. You're trying to figure out where the issues are. And are these issues with a single user, a huge department, maybe the whole company? You're trying to figure out commonalities here. The next phase of discovery is auditing your password hashes against a password list. Now, modern authentication systems should use hashing. They should not just store your passwords, your user passwords in the clear. So you should not, if you work in IT, you should not be able to just open up a table and see what everybody's passwords are. That's a poor authentication system. Active Directory, as the example, they use unsalted but hashed passwords, meaning when a user types in their password, they hit enter. When they set that, Active Directory stores that as just a hash. There's not a way for Active Directory to get from that hash back into the plain text password. But here's what you can do regularly, and I would suggest monthly. If you're just starting this out, regularly attempt, and again, please get permission in your organization before doing this. Attempt to crack those hashes against common word lists and breached password lists. Now, if you're unaware, this is a fun little bit of research. There's a great Darknet Diaries episode on this. In 2009, there was this RockU breach. This was a social media company. They had a breach of 30 million passwords, and they had stored passwords in plain text. Well, what happened was security researchers started changing those plain text passwords into hashed data, and they came up with a really easy database to run to attempt to crack passwords. And that 2009 password list, it's the gift that keeps giving. 12 years later, it still is very effective at finding poor password practices. Users are using passwords that were on this list. And by the way, you can guarantee the bad guys are using this to attempt to leverage against your users or against you. You can also look for duplicate hashes. If you find that 5 people have the same password hash in your organization, that means you've got some evidence of either password sharing or bad password practices. We need to understand here, if users are running around with passwords that can easily be guessed, it may take years to brute force a 17-character password, but not if that 17-character password is password 1. Cyber criminals use this breach list all the time. And by the way, these audits are fast. You can do this in just a few minutes if you audit against a word list. There's a couple of tools that you can use for this. KnowBe4. Now, KnowBe4 sells some products, but this is a piece of freeware they offer. It's very easy to use, called the weak password test. They actually have a word list built into it, so you don't have to go and find another word list and bring it in. And this is actually a screenshot from it on the upper left corner. I don't work for KnowBe4, but I found this as a useful tool. One thing about this tool is it's kind of safe somewhat in that it doesn't actually show you the passwords people are using, but this is a great way to measure how bad your issue is. Black Hills InfoSec, they have lots of great free tools. They have something called the Cred Defense Toolkit. There's some other tools here. You can even manually, there's some, if anybody wants it, reach out to me. I can give this process to you, but you can even manually make a copy of your AD database and crack hashes against a word list with something like John the Ripper. Now, there may be dragons here. If you have endpoint protection, modern endpoint protection, it will absolutely catch you doing this. So remember what I told you earlier, get permission from your organization before you start this audit process, before you start looking under rocks for passwords in your organization, get permission first, because this is going to cause alarms to go off. And a good EDR is going to detect you taking a copy of Active Directory. It's going to detect you doing that. All right. I really got to move forward and get through this. Remember that secure list of passwords you started putting together, from Post-it notes and emails and tickets that you found? I want you to add those passwords to your word list. Okay. Add those passwords to your word list you audit against. You may very well find that password you found in the training room on a Post-it note is used by a lot of users. And again, often bad habits are contagious. This is going to help you understand how widespread your issue is. If you found a ticket with password 5, that password being shared with a user, you may very well find 15 users that are running around with that same password. There's some other resources you can use. Have I Been Pwned? If you're not familiar with them, check them out. Troy Hunt is doing great work there. You can download big password hash lists. You can even, if you have control over your domain name for your organization, you can even subscribe to breach lists that are affected by people in your organization. There's another organization called Dehashed, which will give you breach data. They'll just give you hashes. They won't give you passwords, but you can use this in your audit process to see if users are actually running around with passwords that are commonly breached. And by the way, if you need more resources, check out Mike Muscatel's session from yesterday. When I watched that session, my jaw hit the floor. He showed off some passwords laying around in places. And so something else, do you have a suspicious email reporting process? Do you have a way for a user to forward a message or click a button and send a suspicious message to your team? You may find passwords in those. Now, on the right here, this is one of these nasty extortion scams where the bad guys will send a phishing message to us or to one of our users saying, hey, we've got you on camera and we're going to release this to the public unless you pay up. these nasty extortion scams, you know what they use? They use a password, some breached password in that user's history in the subject line of that message. And what they'll start by saying is, I'm aware that 1997, a password ending in 1997 is one of your passwords. Let's get directly to what I'm talking about. And then they'll threaten you. If you have a breached or a suspicious email reporting process, take these messages, obviously use this to train the users, use this to tell the users, yeah, this is a scam, and go through that process for incident detection and response. But take those passwords and add them to your list you're auditing against. And compile these findings so you can train on them. You're trying to find habits, common issues in your organization. I got to move forward. Now you can start to move to prevention. Now you can start to fix the issue. Now, users will always find a way to break your password protections. This is the part where you give them a reason to care. All right, train users. And you should, user behavior is our first line of defense. We all know that. So craft your user training to fix those behavioral issues you found in your organization. If you found the Post-it notes everywhere, craft your training about that. In fact, if you found that Post-it note in the training room and you ask around and you don't know who left it there, use it as an example. If you found an issue in a department, get in front of that team. Now, remember, you haven't audited everything when you've gone through your Active Directory, because there's a lot of users, as I talked about before, there's a lot of users setting passwords in portals. Train those people too. If payroll's setting users' passwords in a web portal, get in front of them and train them as well. HR newsletters. HR, if your HR department sends out a newsletter, they're probably dying for content every month. Talk to HR and see if you can write something in a newsletter to talk about password practices. Usually they'll say, thank you. Lunch and learns. Do a lunch and learn and have a giveaway, a small gift card there if your company lets you. This Cheeto graphic on the left, this is something I've used before. And one thing that I like to do, if I find a habit, if I find a password scheme that's being used, that's easy to crack, and it's just one of those issues that won't go away, we train people on it and it just still continues, substitute that password on that meme graphic with whatever practice you found in your organization and put that in the newsletter. I'll tell you, in my organization, there's at least a few users who talk about Cheeto passwords. They talk about, oh no, don't set it like that. That's a Cheeto password. All right. And also, don't underestimate the power of training users on how to have better security habits at home. Usually, security habits at home translate into the workplace. Teach people how to protect themselves. I've heard people say before, you've heard this too, but I only use these bad passwords in accounts I don't care about. So ask them, okay, what are those accounts you don't care about? So a little side story, a good friend of mine had a weak password on this person's Facebook account because it's just a social media account. It's not linked to my money or anything. Well, this friend of mine was going on a mission trip, and he was trying to raise money for his mission trip. And he made some Facebook posts about it. Hey, go to my GoFundMe page, click here. And people were giving to him. Well, turns out his Facebook account was breached. It was breached a long time before because of a weak password. The bad guys saw that he was trying to raise money, and they started messaging all of this person's friends, all of my friends, asking for money and sending them to a malicious GoFundMe page. Okay, that's a myth, but I only use passwords and accounts I don't care about. That's a statement based on a myth. And so that's something that we should train our users on. And usually if they become secure at home, that's going to translate into the workplace. Now you can start fixing things technically. Now, any technical solution that you have comes with hard costs where we have to pony up cash, or soft costs where we've made things harder for employees. And now it's going to cost the business 10 minutes on every password reset, or it's going to cost people locking out their accounts because they're now typing in a longer password. When you pitch a technical solution, when you pitch changes to your password rules, be ready with all your discovery findings. That's going to help assuage concerns. If you've got a business leader that says, I don't want to make things hard on the employees, be ready with what you found in the organization. Be ready with, maybe you took pictures of those Post-it notes. Show the pictures of the Post-it notes. Show how bad the problem is. Password filters. I highly recommend running password filters. If you run Azure AD, so if you run Office 365 in your organization, you probably have Azure AD P1, that license. You have this tool called Azure Password Protection. Look at this, read up on this. This comes at no extra cost if you're running that service. And what that'll do is that'll automatically install a password filter. You have to read up on how to do it, but on all of your domain controllers. So when a user tries to run around with a breached password, it'll stop them. It'll say, hey, you're trying to set your password to something that's on a disallowed list. And Microsoft maintains that list. I don't think they're forthcoming yet, at least the stuff that I've read. They're not forthcoming on where they got these passwords, but I've attempted to set breached passwords all over the Rocky list. I've attempted to set a breached password that I had in my history that I knew was breached from years ago on my one of my personal accounts, and it wouldn't let me set that. So turn that on. If you have access to that, research that, turn it on. It may take you 4 or 8 hours, but that is time well spent. There's also some open source projects that allow you to do put password filters if you don't have Azure AD. And I'm sure there's ways to address this in non-Active Directory environments. Complexity, length, expiration, and history. Not really wanting to have a discussion on that, but if you're running around with 8-character password minimums, please consider strengthening them. And if you don't believe me, just Google 8-character passwords. Google that search term. You're going to find lots of objective evidence as why these won't fly anymore, that these can be broken very, very easily. And also, just a little side note, if you're running a password filter like Azure Password Protection, you might not want to do away with password expiration altogether. And the reason why is Microsoft is always adding to that list. And so let's say Jane Smith in sales is running around with a password that she set, that Azure Password Protection said, yeah, this isn't breached, go ahead and run with it. And then 6 months later, it's breached somewhere on the internet. Password Protection adds it to the filter. Jane is not aware of that change. She's not forced to change that. That's also, by the way, why you need to audit. You need to continue auditing. So my recommendation, if you're going to use password filters like that, maybe consider setting your expiration to something like 6 months or a year. Again, you're going to have to deal with your organization, regulatory requirements, things like that. But only at this point should you start addressing password history, expiration, that kind of thing. You've done the discovery, you've done your homework. Some firewalls, this is kind of cool. Some firewalls can measure entered web passwords against AD hashes. I'm not advertising for them, but Palo Alto firewalls can do this. If you sign into a web portal and you type in your password, a lot of firewalls can decrypt that data and alert a security staff if someone attempted to type in their AD password by comparing the hashes, if they tried to type that into a web portal. Now, what that's intended for is that's intended for phishing protection. So people aren't typing in their passwords into bad sites, but you can also leverage that control to help find evidence that people are using the same password in lots of services. You can even stop it. If you're a company that has lots of cloud vendor portals, consider turning on mandatory single sign-on, or maybe using an enterprise password manager. This is really hard to train on, okay? But if you're a company that you have lots of vendors that are business critical, third-party cloud portals, consider doing that. And by the way, keep auditing, keep training. You need to continue fighting the fight. This is not one and done. Prevention controls still have gaps. Auditing makes sure that you're effective at training and preventing. That leads me to my final words. Passwords are not going away anytime soon. And more than anything else, we need to change people's minds so we change their behaviors. So my final words are this: please be easy to approach. People are going to come to you with issues. People are going to come to you upset because they can't continue using their old password scheme when you set up a filter. If you're trying to push for a behavioral change, you need to have finesse when you do that. If you're trying to get people to change their behavior, their habits, we need to learn to hear them out. Try to empathize. Try to address their concerns. No, you're not going to put out every fire that a user brings to you, but at the very least, attempt to hear them out. And don't be a jerk. Please don't be a jerk when people come to you. If people reported you a password issue and they didn't do it in a ticket form, don't berate them and ignore it because it didn't come in as a ticket. Attempt to help them, or maybe just say, hey, I'm going to open up a ticket for you, but I really appreciate you bringing this to me, because your point is you need to build a bridge to the business so they can change their habits. Thank you. I want to ask, does anyone have questions or comments or even criticisms today?
Hey, Jeff, this is Daniel. First off, I just wanted to say this was a great session. So thanks for putting it together and delivering it. So I think, my company that I work for has really good single sign-on and MFA implemented. But one of the things I've kind of been wondering about is for personal account use. Do you know of what are your thoughts about password managers for personal account use, and any kind of brief pros and cons for that?
Sure. That's a great question. Evelyn, let me know if we're running out on time. I know the next session starts in about 15 minutes, but that's a great question. As an organization, now, if we're talking about like allowing users to run a password manager on their work computer, there's an organizational issue to fight there. But I will tell you, I suggest that whenever I give training to users, I try to help them improve their personal lives and help protect their personal security profile. And so almost always I'll give a little one-liner. Hey, we recommend setting unique passwords everywhere, and a password manager helps you get there. I love Bitwarden, used to love LastPass, but usually what I find is when I get that training out in front of people, there's a few like security champions that hop on that and go, yeah, I want to do that. They're in the minority, but yeah, I absolutely believe in password managers. I believe password managers need to be used in the enterprise because there's lots of web portals that companies use. But yeah, I strongly believe in password managers, and I think that we need to be talking to our users about using them. It's hard to train on, though.
Yeah, understood. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, and Daniel, one thing, Apple and Google, they're helping. I don't know if anybody runs Apple services, but I run them for Apple for most of my personal equipment. Apple, if you use their iCloud password manager, so let's say you have a user that uses Apple everywhere, that ecosystem, they've actually started doing things like flagging if you have a saved password in their password manager that's compromised. There's a few iOS releases that they started suggesting that you generate a secure password and just pre-filling it for you. And so I think that Apple's helping fight that fight. Google, I think Chrome's starting to do the same thing as well. I'm not a huge Google user, but I think that they're doing the same thing as well. And that may help kind of cut through some of the tension in our fight with password managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And all my mobile devices are Apple, but I use Windows devices to get on the internet occasionally, so that kind of fails me there. But great call outs. And Nathan, thanks for the tip as well around Bitwarden.
Yeah, Absolutely. I'm with you. I don't use Apple everywhere, so I kind of ignore their password manager suggestions. But for people who are tied into that Apple ecosystem everywhere, yeah, I think that they're doing us some favors there.
Cool. Thanks again.
Does anyone else have questions? Okay. Evelyn, you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for coming. We do have another session after this one. Lori Cole and Elizabeth Fulp, they're going to be speaking. They're from a Fortune 30 financial firm, and I know they have a great session planned for us. And later in the day, we have a workshop. So please join us. And if you have any questions for Jeff later, please let us know. We'd be happy to help. But then thank you so much for joining.
Thank you all.